Hi all, this morning I want to do an overview of the French defence. Now the French defence, if we go to the start position, it has a reputation for being very solid and reliable. It was actually named after a correspondence chess match between London and Paris in 1834. A lot of names of openings were from early correspondence matches in the 1800s, believe it or not. So the French chose this against the English, and so why did they? It blocks in the bishop, one would think. After d4, d5, you see that there's a blocked in bishop on c8. So a lot of French defence strategies revolve not only around this potentially bad piece, but also around the pawn chain. Let's have a quick overview, though, of the main names in the French defence and the early deviations before going into d4. So after e4, e6, what can white do? Queen e2 is known as the Chigorin variation. So there was a famous Russian called Chigorin who actually also innovated with knight c6 in the queen's pawn openings. So Chigorin was actually quite an influential Russian player. And so maybe it's not just those two, but other openings that were named after him. B3 is called the Reti or the Spilman variation. Reti and Spilman, again, both very, very famous players. C4, the Steiner variation. F4, the Le Bourdonnais variation. Le Bourdonnais, a very, very famous French player. D3, the King's Indian attack. So white might later play like G3 and Bishop G2 and play it like a sort of King's Indian attack, reverse King's Indian defence. Knight f3, d5, knight c3 is the two knights variation, so these two knights coming out. Now, very unusual now, after e4, e6, e5 is the Steinitz attack. Actually, Paul Georgiou from Barnet Chess Club once played this against me in Blitz, and it's not as bad as it looks, because after d6, ed, bishop d6, white might play later b3 and bishop b2 and try and overprotect the e5 square. It's a completely different strategy. So e5. So people shouldn't laugh too loudly about that. Knight c3 is the Pelican variation. Here is another dangerous one. After e4, e6, there's a wing gambit which is achieved after knight f3, d5, e5, c5, and now b4. So it's a kind of playing it like a Benko gambit. If cb, a3, and sort of white might play it like a sort of Benko. It gets a lot of pressure on the diagonal, potentially weakening the dark squares of black. So that's another dangerous thing. So these early deviations, there's quite a lot of them in the French defence. Now let's go to look at the main sort of variations. After d4, d5, white could play for a symmetrical pawn structure, which has a kind of boring, drawish reputation. So if white doesn't really want to lose, maybe this is a very good idea if white just wants to draw a much stronger player. You see the symmetrical pawn structure, it minimises the winning chances for both sides. Nevertheless, black might try and play aggressively and break the symmetry, like, for example, an early bishop g4. Or later, instead of just if white deploys the knight to f3, black might actually deploy his or her knight to e7. So there's ways of black changing the symmetry a little. But yeah, the French defence player probably doesn't want white in general to play that if they want an exciting game. The advanced variation, that gives black a lot of pawn chain undermining ideas. So c5, c3. I think there's two main variations here. Knight c6 with the idea of then queen b6, or just bishop d7. Now with an intriguing idea of just trying to exchange off these light squared bishops. So, and there's a gambit here with c4 though, which black needs to be aware of. So the advanced variation. So after e4, e6, d4, d5, we have also the Milner-Barry gambit. Let's have a look at that. e5, c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, queen b6. Now white lets go of the d-pawn for a very strong attack. So cd here. Bishop d7 to stop the bishop b5 check. If knight d4, queen d4, bishop b5 check. But white just castles now, allowing the d-pawn to go. But white has a strong initiative, allowing even the e-pawn to go. But black hasn't castled yet, and there's a famous tower game where he crushes his opponent in this. So that's Milner-Barry's gambit. Let's go back now. The Tarrasch variation, d4, d5, knight d2 instead of knight c3. We'll have a look at knight c3 in a bit. So this Tarrasch, in the open Tarrasch, it's this, c5, and white can aim to give black an isolated queen pawn. And, for example, like this. So black's got this isolated queen pawn here. But black would have a lot of piece play. So let's go back now. The Tarrasch variation, knight d2. There's also other alternatives for black. The closed variation with knight f6. So encouraging a kind of closed pawn structure. Now white might actually play knight df3 here and knight g2, or bishop d3 and knight g2 with g3. Also another possibility. So there's a lot of theory on this. Pardon me. So, knight d2. Knight c6 is known as the Guimard variation. Knight d2, bishop e7. Now this could be a good move waiting idea, because if white commits the knight and black plays this, you'll notice that white's f-pawn is blocked. So black can undermine, whilst white doesn't have the classical undermining of f4 and f5 available. So there's a couple of intriguing move waiting ideas, not just bishop e7, but also h6, with the same idea, wanting white to block this key f-pawn, so that the classic pawn chain undermining strategies are not available for white as easily. So two great innovations if you want to surprise a player there, after knight d2. Let's have a look now. The main variation is knight c3. Let's have a look at that now. So this is called the Poulsen variation. If black plays bishop b4, we have the winner variation, and it often goes like this. And there's some Fischer games here, where Fischer's plan is a lot of the time to later play a4 and bishop a3 and try and gain pressure on this dark square diagonal. So that's the Marshall, the winner variation. There's a lot of theory on this. So after knight c3, what are the main alternatives for black instead of bishop b4? Actually, d takes e is the Rubinstein variation, and one idea of this is the Fort Knox with bishop d7 and bishop c6. Bishop c6. The Fort Knox variation has got a reputation of being very solid for black. So black's got rid of that bad bishop, or put it on a useful diagonal, and may take on f3 and later close up with c6 later for a very solid Caro-Kann-like defence. So after knight c3 here, now let's look at knight c3 again. Bishop b4, bishop d2 is the finger slip variation. E takes and e takes is the exchange variation of the winner. Knight ge2 is the Maroczy gambit, or the Alekhine gambit. Bishop d3 is actually called the Poulsen variation, but e5 is the main line winner. As what I've said, there's some Fischer games as examples there, and a lot of theories on that mainline winner. There's some razor sharp lines, by the way, in this. You really need to know your theory. I'd recommend getting the book Played in French by I am John Watson if you really want to explore these lines in great detail. Just coming to the end now of this very, very brief overview. Knight c3, knight f6 is the classical variation of the French defence. Bishop d3 here is the Swiss variation. E takes d5 is Svennius variation. E5 is the Steinitz variation, and bishop g5 is the mainline classical. So that ends this very, very brief overview of the French defence. So named because of its the early correspondence match in 1834 when a Paris team beat London. If you want to learn more, please do get that book by Watson, Play the French. It's a landmark book, very well written. He's a very good author. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for listening, and see you on YouTube.